of the governor's working group on highway funding. And we've got a big agenda today. We have the agenda in front of you, as well as all of the material that we'll go through today. There are a few people who won't be with us today. Scott McGeorge, Dr. Bowen, and Judge Holmes have all said that they were unable to make it today, so they won't be here. I figured we'd start by reviewing really the broad goals of the governor's working group on highway funding while we're here, what we're looking at. At this point, we're in the information gathering stage. We're moving through the process of looking at the highway funding issues that we face as a state. Last month, we took an overall view from the highway department. This month, today, we're going to look at a number of things. The big thing being from the Department of Finance and Administration, we're going to look at the existing highway revenues and some of the tax-based funding issues that we have as a state. And I want to go ahead and say that we visited with the governor this week. He believes that we're right where we need to be. He looks at this as an information gathering process, and so we're very early in that process at this point, but we'll continue to work through that process. One of the things that he noted was that he wants to get our feedback as we do move through that process. So I would recommend that we all start to think individually about what we know at this point, kind of what we think we would recommend given what we know at this point. And as we move through the process, just keep on thinking about that. I think that we all come from different backgrounds, different areas, different interests, and so our individual ideas are going to be very important to the process, and that's feedback that we want to continue to give to the governor as we work through this. So another thing I want to note today is that we are streaming. We streamed the last meeting. There were over 200 people that watched through Meerkat. This month we're streaming on the House website, and so just be aware that we're involving the public through the House streaming. And with that, I'll go ahead and recognize Scott Bennett. He's going to give us an update from the last meeting. Some of the questions we had last time were the ranges of funding, the timing of the funding needs, and he'll also give us an update on what's going on the federal level. And with that, Scott, you're recognized.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's certainly good to see everybody back here again. And that's right, one of the things we ended the last meeting with was, you know, what's the target level of funding that we're looking at and the timing of that funding. And even since then, you know, the question came up about the state revenue we do receive and how that revenue is distributed, and a little bit about project selection, and then, like you said, the federal issue. And we'll go through those things as quickly as we can. I know DFNA is here to present some more information on the state revenue side. Hopefully we won't have a lot of overlap, but I imagine there would be some. First of all, the state highway revenue that we receive, and this is going to be extremely hard to see, but I think it's actually in your packet also behind the first tab. If you'll flip through there, you'll see what we call funnel chart. This one's for 2014. I think DFNA does have some revenue for 2015, but it's a very good picture of how we get the revenue that we do. Comes from a lot of different sources, but we'll see what actually ends up coming to the department also. And one thing I want to point out, we talk about the highway revenue distribution formula being 70% to the department and 15% to cities and 15% to counties, but there are actually 7 entities among which that revenue is divided. There is the department, there's cities, there's counties. Funds also go to the Central Services Fund, to constitutional and fiscal agencies, to the state police, and to the Department of Environmental Quality. So what you end up seeing is the revenue that the department receives over that time is about 63.5% of all the state revenue, state highway revenue that's coming into the department. And this is a picture of the current sources. About 85% of it does come from motor fuel taxes and vehicle registration fees. Since 2008, we've received a natural gas severance tax. It came in at about $72 million gross this past year. That is one of the things that has really kept our revenue propped up over the last few years because of consumption trending downward. Then when you look at the ways that that revenue is distributed, $670 million coming in, about 63% of it coming to the department. Cities and counties each get 16% through the normal revenue distribution formula that we call turn back, and from a penny of fuel tax dedicated to each, a state aid for counties program and a state aid for cities program. The remaining 5% goes to the constitutional and fiscal agencies, to state police, and to the Department of Environmental Quality. So that's just a basic plain rundown of the state highway revenue coming into the state and the way it's distributed and what the department gets in the end. Project selection, I tell you, it's a long, very, very detailed process, but I want to run through this with you quickly. It's a very data intensive and data driven process. One of the first things you've got to know is that we're required by the federal government to have a fiscally constrained construction program, and that's developed on a 4-year basis, and that shows where the department and the commission plan to spend our money, the money that we anticipate having. The current STIP that we're under goes through fiscal year 2016. The next one that we're developing will add 2017, 18, and 19 to the program. So there's a last year, first year overlap. And one of the things that's important to understand is that if a project is not in this STIP, we can't spend any money on it, with very little exception. That exception really is for maintenance, administration, and operations, but for developing improvement projects, it has to be in this document. Now, and this is a mix of federal and state revenue when we get to this point. On average, what we project receiving from the Federal Highway Administration is about $490 million a year. From state funds going forward, we're projecting about $410 million a year. Now that's a little bit different than what we received this past year, mostly because of severance tax being up. Some of the projections that we see show severance tax pretty flat and still the consumption trending downward. So this is a conservative estimate going forward, mainly because it has to be fiscally constrained. So it's a very conservative approach that shows a total of $900 million that'll be available from federal and state sources to the department. Well, once we know that amount, we start taking out the things that really can't be spent on construction. So from the federal side, you've got those fixed budgeted expenditures for maintenance, administration, and operations, and some of those things are eligible for federal funds. We get $30 million reimbursement for that. That's less than 10% of the total maintenance, administration, and operations. Then there are projects that are not highway projects that federal funds are dedicated to, and that's the Transportation Alternatives Program. It's trails, transportation enhancements, safe routes to schools, things like that. There are federal funds that are dedicated to city streets and county roads. There are federal funds that are dedicated to the bigger urban areas of the state that they'll control, and then there are funds dedicated to metropolitan planning, and those go to the bigger areas of the state also. And then there's a non-construction program, and that's the money that is dedicated by the federal law to state planning and research, and a lot of that money will actually go out to universities in the form of research grants. Then we have this little thing called obligation limitation, and basically what happens is for every dollar the federal government appropriates to you, they tell you you can only spend about 90 cents of it. So there's 10 cents that we call impounded, and there's a lot of theories about why they do that. Part of it is a cash management issue. Part of it is to really make the federal budget look a little more balanced than it really is, which really has nothing to do with highways. And that balance was building up over time. And then back in the late 90s and early 2000s, Congress made the decision to start spending down that balance. And that's why some of our federal highway programs have increased over time. They weren't increased because there was more revenue coming into the trust fund. It was spending down some of the balances. So you've got 134 million that really comes off the top that can't be spent for highway programs. And in the state funds, $280 million for those fixed budgeted expenditures, which is our maintenance, administration, and operations, and then our match for the state planning and research. So there's $282 million of state funds that aren't spent on highway construction. So that then there's another couple of items that we have to consider, and that is the funds that are committed to paying off the bonds for our interstate rehabilitation program. So there's $58 million of federal funds that are committed that came from a category that they had in the past called interstate maintenance. So those federal funds couldn't be used for anything but rehabilitation of the interstate. And then 4 cents of our diesel tax revenue is dedicated to paying off those bonds. So that's $74 million that is going to debt retirement. And what that leaves us with is $410 million for a construction program. That's our normal construction program. Above and beyond that, we do still have the bond program for the interstates, and we have the 0.5-cent sales tax program that'll be going on for the next few years. But that $410 million does also have to cover buying right-of-way and moving utilities, which is about $60 million a year. So really our normal lettings for a year, about $350 million. When you start to break it down, though, we actually don't have full control over even that amount of money. We have to take care of bridges. Historically, they've had a category of funds from the feds that are called bridge replacement and rehabilitation. That's been about $90 million a year, and we're going to be measured on the performance of our bridges, so we have to keep spending money to take care of our bridges. Those are based on inspections that are performed by certified inspectors in accordance with national standards. The bridges are rated, cost estimates, and then we try to take care of those from a worst to best category. So we put them in line and fund them as far as the $90 million a year will go. Then there's an amount of funds that came from that interstate maintenance category that is being used in the interstate rehabilitation program as pay-as-you-go funds and above and beyond the bond funds, because that interstate rehabilitation program that we showed to the people that was voted on in 2011 was a $1.2 billion program. Well, we've issued $575 million in bonds. Well, you can't get $1.2 billion worth of work from $575 million in bonds. So the rest of that money is coming from this category as pay-as-you-go projects over the life of that program. Then we're required, there's a set-aside category of safety funds, and that's close to $50 million a year. And those projects are selected in accordance with a lot of data analysis on crash rates, railroad crossing. We have hazard ratings at railroad crossings, and they're spent in accordance with our strategic highway safety plan, which is developed in coordination with a lot of agencies around the state and submitted to the Federal Highway Administration. The focus there from the federal level is on low-cost, high-value safety improvements, rumble strips, the cable median barriers, things like that are trying to reduce our occurrences, mainly of run-off-the-road crashes. That's one of the biggest things we have. So when you look at all of those things, almost $180 million is really specified for categories. So when you take those into consideration, at commission discretion, we have about $230 million a year. And again, that includes right-of-way and utility costs. So, we've talked before about having $20 billion in needs, and you try to lay that out and spend $230 million a year, and you see how that really becomes a thankless job to kind of try to meet the needs. But yes, ma'am. A little bit. It used to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 million, and one of the things that's happened is remember from the State Aid for Cities program, Well, there's $20 million that's dedicated to a city street program that we don't have anymore. So there have been some things like that that have taken away some of the discretion and the size of what's available.
Randy, go ahead and use your mic if you could.
Sure. Quick question. You mentioned on the Garvey program, you only issued $575 million in bonds against the 1.2. Why was the total amount not issued?
Oh, the 575 million was what we had authority to issue. That was what the people voted on. We were given the authority to issue $575 million in bonds. But not only did we do that, we committed the other funds that had historically been set aside from the federal level for interstate maintenance from that specific category to the interstate program. Because at the time we were developing the program, we still had that interstate maintenance category. They came along later and changed it and collapsed a lot of them. And when we're in the process of developing this next step, and one of our targets is to spend about 80% of the money on system preservation, which is taking care of our roads and bridges, pavement condition, and relieving congestion where there's congestion. And then about 20% of the revenue on capital improvements, which would be, connecting cities, building new interchanges and things like that to promote economic development. But when we start to look at projects, and again, this is a very complex and data-driven approach, but we keep track of the pavement condition over time. We've got a log of every mile and the condition of the pavement, how many cracks, the severity of the cracks, the rutting and all that. We can predict the performance of it, so we know the condition of our roads just like we do our bridges. A lot of traffic counts and traffic analysis, so we know where the congestion is. Same thing with safety, all of the safety data that we do, that we gather and analyze, and all of these really go into the mix of the projects that we're considering, along with a lot of public input and coordination with local officials about their needs and their priorities. So all of these things really go into just the projects that are really needed around the state. And then you've got the analysis that we do that kind of shows what's worse, what we're going to get the best value from implementing, and then we put all those into a draft document that we circulate for public input, take public comment on the projects that we're proposing, and once that document is finalized and the commission adopts it, then it's turned into the Federal Highway Administration for their approval. So it's a pretty long and sometimes pretty onerous process to get to what projects are in this 4-year document that we can start project development on. So that's that part in a nutshell.
Are there any other questions on that? Scott, I was wondering about on Exhibit 2, I think that's the 4th page, or the 5th page, the $280 million, the fixed budgeted expenditures.
Yes.
What is that exactly?
Okay, fixed budgeted expenditures are really our cost of doing business. So from the maintenance standpoint, you have materials that we have to buy, you have equipment that we have to buy, dump trucks, backhoes, motor patrols, things like that, for us to do our own maintenance. Even right down to mowers and weed eaters and chainsaws and things like that. So that's the money that is set aside for our crews to do maintenance around the state. The administration is simply just running the department, and then that's mostly salaries and overhead for the people that aren't necessarily out on the road doing the actual work. People that are in the office that are doing design, things like that. Operations would be the folks that are out in the field that are inspecting highway projects. Our highway police group is there, and then of course salaries, overtime, overhead, which is insurance, match for insurance, workers' comp, and all of those things. So maintenance, administration, and operations is really the cost of running a department, and all of the things that we have to do besides the construction that you see going on.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions on this part of the presentation? If not, we'll go, Larry, you're recognized.
On the amount that goes to the cities and the counties, do you have any control over that? And does that all go into the roads in the cities and counties?
That money goes into the roads in the cities and counties, and I'll tell you, we have a little bit of control over that. In some of the old federal programs, you used to have money that was dedicated to city streets and to county roads. And we really kept that going through the changes in federal legislation, and it's about $2 million a year that's dedicated to city streets, and they have to meet federal criteria. You know, we typically design them, let them contract, inspect them, turn them back over to the cities. There's about $2 million a year that goes to counties for county roads, and there's a couple of $1 million a year that goes to cities and counties for bridge improvements. So that money, that part of it adds up to about $6 million a year. So that's good. That goes to cities and counties for specific road, street, and bridge improvements. Now the others, the Transportation Alternatives Program, we have no control over. And that has to be given out in grants to people for recreational trails and things like that. The Urban Attributable Program, that's, and I can't remember the exact number, it's probably somewhere around $20 million a year of money that's dedicated to the major urban areas in the state, and that's Central Arkansas and Northwest Arkansas and a little bit to West Memphis. And they have a board of directors of their planning organization that controls where that money goes. And then the metropolitan planning goes to 8 different metropolitan planning organizations around the state. That makes up the rest of it for that $45 million.
An observation as I was preparing for the meeting, less than a third of the revenue that's available goes to the construction and maintenance of highways. I thought that was...
Well, to construction, that's right. I mean, there is a lot of that $280 million that the chairman mentioned earlier would go to the maintenance that we perform ourselves, but you're right. I mean, less than a third of what we receive actually goes back out to construction because there's so many other categories that it has to be spent on from a federal level and just from the cost of running a department.
Well, one last question. As the state would go about increasing the $230 million, say there was another 200 to be added to that, is any of that redistributed back into any of these other categories in some sort of proportional basis? Or would that all go straight to the bottom line of the $230 million?
I think that depends on what the legislature would do.
Other than 30%, I guess.
Well, I mean, even that is subject to legislature approval. There are some categories, and it's not a lot. The storage tank and fuel tax fund is about $8 million. It goes to ADEQ, to clean up those leaking underground storage tanks from old gas stations. I don't know what their balance is. I'm not sure that they spend $8 million a year in that. The money coming in from driver's license fees and things like that, $2 million a year goes straight to state police, comes off the top. And then there's a couple $1 million that comes off for the commercial truck safety and education program that the legislature approved. Special permit fees, those are really our oversized, overweight permit fees for commercial vehicles. That really comes off the top and all comes to us. The rest of it is all distributed 70, 15, 15. So it would depend on how the legislature really set it up. I mean, in plain and simple terms, if you put the whole $670 million into a 70, 15, 15 split, it would give us another $50 or $60 million a year. But then you don't have money that goes to like $21 million a year goes to constitutional and fiscal agencies. You don't have the money that goes to ADEQ for cleaning up underground storage tanks and things like that. So I mean, we're sensitive to those things, but just changing the revenue distribution formula to a pure 70, 15, 15 split would give us a lot more revenue. even with the split still going to cities and counties.
All right, thank you for that. So I think the next one was the potential funding targets.
Well, before we do that, quickly, I want to go through the federal impact. And Robert Morey from the governor's office was at the commission meeting last week and heard us talk about this. And I mean, one point I want to make is that, you know, a lot of things that happen are really out of our control. And you know, historically, we hear a lot about, you know, the all-powerful department and commission, but, you know, with all due respect, with the great responsibility we've been given, there are a lot of things that we have no control over. You know, we have no control over how much revenue we get. We have no control over the cost of construction or equipment or anything like that. We have no control over where the traffic is or how much traffic there is. And those are a lot of things that we're trying to handle. We don't have the authority or responsibility to increase revenue or user fees on our own. And there are a lot of entities that can do that. You know, utilities increase their usage fees a lot of times. Parks can increase their park fees. Higher education can increase tuition, which is a user fee. And we can't do that. So there's a lot of things that we really don't have control over. We believe we manage and control everything that we can as best we can, but there's just so much of it that's beyond our control, and it's never been more evident than now with what's going on in Washington. You can see, I mean, if we've got, you know, $490 million of our revenue, over half of our revenue coming from federal sources, we rely a lot on what happens in Washington. And that's something that's extremely important, and want to go through the options that are being talked about now in Washington, and they're probably changing as we speak right now. My notes said, you know, what can be done in Washington, or what is being done in Washington. I guess we could talk about what's not being done in Washington. But there is a Senate bill that would be it would authorize programs for 6 years, but only have funding for 3 years. What that means is the 75 projects that we've withdrawn so far this year could be put back in lettings, and we could continue with our current STIP and 2 out of the 3 years of our next STIP. And that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. But one thing you got to note is they are putting more money in this program, and if they put more federal money in this program, it's going to take us more state money to match it. It's going to average about $65 million in additional state funds needed to match this federal money over the life of this bill, and it goes from like $20 million in the first year to a little over $80 million in the last year. Then you got the House bill, and the House has already passed their bill, which is a short-term extension until almost the end of the year, and it does have additional revenue in it, but it really is to keep us at current funding levels. So at that point, we could reschedule the 75 projects that we've withdrawn, but our 2016 program is still very much in jeopardy. Well, then you've got just the issue of, well, authorization is going to expire at the end of this week, July the 31st, if they don't do anything at all. Well, they could extend the authorization of the federal highway programs, but not put any additional money into the highway trust fund. If they do that, they haven't gone into cash management mode by the end of the year. We can start to reschedule those 75 withdrawn projects, but we're going to have to go a year without a federal highway program. That means no new federal obligations in 2016, so we can't let any of the projects that we currently have scheduled for 2016. And then the worst case scenarios, if they go home the end of this week and they haven't done anything, and the authorization for those federal programs lapses. Well, obviously that means no more federal money, but what it really means is that we have to shut down the federal aid projects that we have ongoing right now. And we're going to have to shut down a lot of projects around the state that are under construction at this point if they go home at the end of this week without doing anything at all. Like I said, it's probably changing as we speak. They've got another option on the table now that's somewhere in the middle. but we'll see. The House said they're gonna go home Thursday. The Senate hasn't even voted on theirs. The House said they're not gonna take up the Senate bill. The Senate said they're not gonna take up the House bill.
I got a text a few
There you
minutes
have
ago,
it.
the House voted on a 3-month extension without XM.
Okay. 3 months will get you till the end of October. That might let us do a few of the withdrawn projects, but it's still, they kicked the can down the road and it landed in a pothole, so I'm not sure they can kick it anymore.
The Senate has to do something.
Senate still has to do something, and they're still working on that 6-year bill to try to get it passed.
Thank you, Scott. Any other questions on the federal funding, federal update? Representative Hickerson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Bennett, I would like to see if you all have any type of analysis on just how much what fiscal impact this has had on the state of Arkansas in terms of revenue, lost jobs, that type of thing, on our economy, just the projects that have had to be pulled, and I don't know if I'm sure you all have some rough figures to date, the projects that have not been, able to be let here in the last 6 months.
I'll give you one here in just a second. How's that?
Because I know this is affecting our economy in every state that has had to delay or pull projects. It has to, and it's going to get worse.
It's had an impact on almost 7,500 jobs around the state because of the number of jobs that a highway construction project either creates or sustains. So that means there's 7,500 jobs around the state that would have been either created or would have been supported by that highway work that we've had to pull. That's pretty substantial. And I know, there are contractors around the state that have had to either shuffle people around or lay people off already. So it has had a definite direct impact already.
All right, thank you for that. And I think the final thing is the potential funding targets. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
And that was really the last thing we talked about at our first meeting. The range of funding and the timing of funding that would be needed from the state level and what really could be done. And we've broken it down into an immediate or short term, into a mid-range, and into a long term. It really within the next couple of years, and the mix of what we would do with the state funding would depend on which version of the federal highway bill passes. But we need $110 million a year additional to be sure that we can match the federal aid that's coming in, whether it's from just the existing levels or from the little bit of extra money the House has put in or from what the Senate has put in, and to meet critical needs like having an overlay program that we weren't able to have this year. If we could